Hello, class, and welcome to Forensic Psychology. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I will be your instructor for this course. This week, we're going to be exploring a little bit of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. Now, have you ever met someone who just seemed to lack empathy? They manipulated others without remorse, or even appeared charming, but ultimately you know that they were being deceitful. Now, these traits might not be immediately recognizable, but they can be indicators of deeper psychological issues. So, in today's class, we're going to be exploring a little bit of the kinds of people that we will often encounter in our work life, in our school life, in our social circles. And many people have a wide variety. There's a wide variety of personalities within people, across in society, across the spectrum. But I want you to consider this. There's about 1% of the general population who's classified as psychopathic. And this means that out of every 100 people you meet, statistically, one will likely have psychopathic traits. Now, additionally to that, there is antisocial personality disorder, which is a recognized personality disorder, a mental disorder, that encompasses a broader range of antisocial behaviors and is more common. It affects about 3% of men and about 1% of women. It varies a little bit, but that's about roughly what we know that it covers. Now, these disorders are not just concepts in textbooks. There are real-world people that we know that are in boardrooms, in our offices, in our workplace, in our prison cells. And it's key to understand how these people think and be able to recognize them, especially when they have power over us, because that becomes very dangerous. Now, as always, I like to start off with a little story, and then I want to cover three main themes. First off, I want to talk a little bit about defining antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy and emphasize the difference between the two. First off, psychopathy is characterized by some specific personality traits, but it isn't considered a mental disorder per se. Those personality traits of psychopathy are probably not things that you would expect. Superficial charm, for example, is one of them. Another, though, is lack of empathy. And the other one is manipulativeness. So they're able to be charming because they don't have the anxiety about hurting people. And that becomes very dangerous. But it also allows them to be very successfully manipulative. And so it's important to be aware that there are people like that out there, and to be able to recognize them when they introduce themselves into your life so that you can avoid being victimized by them. And then there is antisocial personality disorder, which is a broader diagnosis focused on chronic, rigid patterns of antisocial behavior and disregard for other person's rights. And so when we understand these definitions and distinctions, and we'll dive into it much deeper, but when we understand these distinctions, we can more accurately identify and diagnose these disorders, both clinically and in forensic settings, which is very valuable, particularly in investigations. Then we'll look at some of the neurobiological underpinnings of the development of psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. We'll discuss some of the brain structure and functional abnormalities, the genetic predispositions and environmental influences that may interact with the biological factors. And we'll also explore the societal impact, because there is a broad impact that can happen with psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, including crime, incarceration, mental health care, impact on victims and families and communities. But if you have these people in charge of government organizations, then a breakdown of the societal structures, and that can lead to even more serious consequences for a society and for the societies around that society. So, the person I want to introduce you to today is Robert Hare. He's a very prominent figure in the field of psychology, and he's really known for his groundbreaking work in psychopathy. He was born in Calgary, Alberta, Canada in 1934, and did some significant work in helping us to understand psychopathy and the different personality traits around psychopathy. And he developed something known as the psychopathy checklist, and then the psychopathy checklist revised, or the Hare psychopathy checklist. As you can see, an image of it there, that's a picture of an old version, and a tool which is widely used in both clinical and forensic settings in order to assess psychopathic traits. Now, Robert Hare, he grew up in Canada. He did his undergraduate studies at the University of Alberta, and went on to get a PhD from the University of Western Ontario. And through his career, he spent most of his time at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada, just north of Seattle, where he really did focus on researching the personalities of prisoners and individuals with a history of criminal behavior. And his work is what led to the original psychopathy checklist in the 1980s, and then the revised version. And his research has really shaped our understanding of psychopathy as a very distinct clinical construct, separate from other personality disorders like antisocial personality disorder. He would describe psychopathy as superficial charm, as lack of remorse or guilt, and manipulativeness, which are central concepts in psychopathy. And this legacy has brought about some significant impacts, particularly in risk assessment and offender rehabilitation, and assessing whether or not someone should be released, or in Canada, they have something called the dangerous offender, where someone can, if they're branded a dangerous offender, they will likely never get out of prison. But it's based upon largely having a strong criminal record, but then on top of that, having these personality traits that show very statistically and strongly that the person will be a harm to society. He's also written some well-known books. One is called Without Conscience, The Disturbing World of the Psychopaths Among Us. And you can see another one there called Snakes in Suits. And the Snakes in Suits one highlights another interesting thing, and that is that there are a significant portion of companies that hire CEOs that are indeed psychopaths, and they become psychopaths because they are able to have a lot of charm. They're able to be very sociable. They're able to lie very easily. They have a lack of remorse or guilt for what their company is doing in order to maximize profits, and they're very manipulative with board members and with society at large. And in so doing, they gain a lot of reward, because part of what they do is manipulate people to do what they want. And so by using a corporation, they are able to get away with things that an individual would not be able to get away with. So that is a little bit about psychopathy. Now, I've already mentioned the difference between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, but let's go over it again just to drive the idea home. It's really essential, I think, to understand the distinction between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder, as these concepts, while they're related, really represent different constructs within psychology and psychiatry. So psychopathy is not officially recognized as a distinct disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual version 5, the revised version that we are currently working with, whereas antisocial personality disorder is a formally defined disorder. So what do we mean by psychopathy? Psychopathy is really a personality construct that is characterized by a specific set of affective, so feeling, they don't feel the way other people feel, interpersonal, they don't typically interact with other people the way other people do, and behavioral traits. And these traits include profound lack of empathy. They just don't care for other people. And so they're able to use and manipulate other people the way other people just wouldn't ever fathom of doing. They have superficial charm. Their manipulativeness, they're egocentric, they're very interested in just themselves, and a tendency to engage in antisocial behaviors. Now, importantly, psychopathy is not classified as a distinct disorder in the DSM-5, as I've mentioned, but it is instead, it's considered a bit of a subset of antisocial personality disorder when we're talking about disorders here. Now, the key traits of psychopathy that we see in the hair are things like glibness or superficial charm. They like to talk. Grandiose sense of self-worth. They consider themselves better than everybody else, smarter, more competent, worth more. They are pathological liars. They lie about everything and they just don't feel bad, but they sound so confident in doing so that people just believe them, because our default position is to believe people when they sound confident. Manipulativeness, lack of remorse or guilt, a shallow affect. They just don't have this depth of feeling that other people do. And a failure to accept responsibility for one's actions. They will twist their thinking so that it's always the other person's fault, it's somebody else's fault. And so these traits are often assessed using the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, which is that tool that we've already mentioned. Then there is antisocial personality disorder, which is a very formally recognized mental disorder. It used to be considered what was called the level 2 disorder, a personality disorder. What personality disorders are, though, are rigid, pervasive patterns. So when you have a antisocial personality disorder, what's that saying is that person is presenting pervasive, rigid patterns of disregard for and the violation of rights of others. And personality disorders tend to have always been there. So this is something that has been around in childhood or early adolescence and continues into adulthood. So the diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder is based primarily on observable behaviors such as repeated unlawful acts, deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, aggressiveness, and consistent patterns of irresponsibility. And the DSM-5 criteria for antisocial personality disorder includes behaviors like engaging in criminal activities, being deceitful, acting impulsively, being irritable. And so there's a conceptual difference between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. They're related, but they are distinct constructs now. So while psychopathy includes behavioral elements, it is primarily defined by personality traits, such as lack of empathy, shallow affect, and manipulativeness. Now, antisocial personality disorder, on the other hand, is more behaviorally focused, with the DSM-5 criteria centering on chronic patterns of antisocial behavior. So unlike antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy is not formally recognized by the DSM-5, but in forensic psychology, it is recognized as a valuable tool because it measures psychopathic traits that are often used to assess the risk of criminal behavior and recidivism. Now, when we think of the whole concept of psychopathy, it really kind of dates back to the 19th century, when it was used to describe various personality disorders. And over time, the understanding of psychopathy became more focused on specific personality traits associated with criminal behavior and lack of empathy. As far as antisocial personality disorder becoming its own thing, it was really introduced in 1980, and that marked a shift towards a more behaviorally based approach to personality disorders with the DSM-3. So there's some importance for the distinction here in as far as forensic psychology. And the distinction between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorders, I think, is particularly important in forensic psychology because psychopathy is strongly associated with higher rates of violent behavior and recidivism. And this makes it a critical factor in risk assessment and legal decisions. And this is in contrast to antisocial personality disorder, which encompasses a broader range of antisocial behaviors, some of which may not involve the same level of risk. So when it comes to treatment and management, it becomes important to differentiate between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder. Now, in treating somebody with antisocial personality disorder, the thing that's very tricky is that, or psychopathy, is that people with antisocial personality disorder, a large group of them are very irritable and don't really like to get along with people. They might be glib, but they're typically will get upset with you as well and do a lot of complaining. Whereas someone with psychopathy will always be, or typically always be, very friendly and happy towards you until they're not. And they're very charming and can be very convincing that yes, they do feel bad about things and they know how to say the right words and emote the right way, but deep down they know they're just playing the game. So it's very tricky. So let's look a little bit deeper at antisocial personality disorder as it's defined in the DSM-5-TR, because it is a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others, beginning in early childhood or adolescence. So basically, as far as you can look back, you can see this pattern being there, and it continues on into adulthood. And they should have at least 3 of the following criteria. First off, failure to conform to social norms. So there's repeatedly engaging in behaviors that are grounds for arrest, like destroying property, harassing others, stealing, or pursuing illegal occupations. Or deceitfulness, so frequent lying or use of aliases or conning others for personal profit or pleasure. Or impulsivity or failure to plan ahead, so acting on the spur of the moment without considering the consequences or failing to develop long-term plans. Irritability and aggressiveness, so repeatedly being involved in physical fights or assaults. A reckless disregard for the safety of self and others, okay? Engaging in behaviors that pose a significant risk to oneself or to other people without really any concern for the potential harm. Consistent irresponsibility, so repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations. And a lack of remorse, so being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another person. So to be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, an individual must be at least 18 years old, and there must be evidence of conduct disorder. So with an onset before 15. And the behavior should not occur exclusively during, say, a bipolar episode or schizophrenia, although those can be present. But that would be a dual diagnosis, not just a diagnosis for antisocial personality disorder. So while psychopathy is not formally recognized by the DSM-5, it is often assessed using that tool, the HARE psychopathy checklist. And psychopathy is characterized by a set of affective and interpersonal traits that are often more severe than those observed in antisocial personality disorder. So the core traits will include things like lack of empathy. So psychopaths will exhibit a profound inability to understand or share the feelings of others. They may recognize that others have emotions, but remain emotionally detached and indifferent to the suffering they cause. They'll have superficial charm. Many psychopaths are skilled at presenting themselves in a charming and engaging manner, often masking their true intentions and manipulating others for personal gain. There's manipulativeness. Psychopaths are often highly manipulative, using deceit and coercion to control others. And they may exploit relationships and situations to achieve their goals without regard for the harm they cause. They have a shallowness of affect. Psychopaths often have a shallow range of emotions. They may display emotions that are insincere or exaggerated, primarily for the purpose of manipulating others. Having a grandiose sense of worth. Psychopaths frequently exhibit an inflated sense of their own importance, believing they are superior to others and entitled to special treatment. And then finally, a lack of remorse or a lack of guilt. Now, this is similar to antisocial personality disorder, but still want to include it there, that psychopaths demonstrate a marked lack of remorse or guilt for their actions. They will typically rationalize their behavior or simply not care about the impact they have on others. So when we think in terms of the comparing psychopathy and antisocial personality in the clinical setting, antisocial personality is diagnosed based upon behavior patterns from the DSM-5, and treatment typically focuses on managing behavior and improving their ability to function in society. Psychopathy, though, is not officially diagnosed and recognized as a separate diagnosis in the clinical setting, but it is considered to be valuable for evaluating the severity and persistence of antisocial behaviors. As far as the forensic setting, though, in the forensic setting, the distinction between antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy becomes much more important. Psychopathy is often associated with that, remember, that higher risk of violent behavior and recidivism. And so it becomes a very critical factor in risk assessment as far as sentencing and parole decisions. So using the scores received by the psychopathy, Hare psychopathy checklist, the revised version, gives a lot of information to a parole board, for example, for figuring out the decisions of likelihood and danger of this person in entering society. So here's a little bit of epidemiological data on antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, because I think it's really crucial to grasp the broader societal implications of these disorders. When we think about the prevalence of antisocial personality disorder, it's a relatively common personality disorder, between 2 and 4% of the general population. And so it makes it a fairly frequently diagnosed personality disorder. And as far as incarceration in the population, about half to 2/3 of male prisoners will meet the criterion for antisocial personality disorder. There's a very high, strong association between antisocial personality disorder and criminal behavior. But there's also gender differences, and that points to some genetic factors going on here. So antisocial personality disorder is more commonly diagnosed in men than in women, with a ratio of about 3-to-1 men to women. And this difference is attributed to, first off, some societal norms, but also biological predispositions and the differences in how antisocial behaviors manifest themselves between genders. Now, if we look at the prevalence of psychopathy, research would suggest about 1% of the general population exhibits psychopathic traits at a clinical level. Now, you can see some of these in a greater part of the population, up to 5%, some will say. But in contrast to the general population, psychopathy is much more prevalent among individuals in the criminal justice system. But it's only around 15 to 25% of males meet the criteria for psychopathy in the prison system. But that's obviously much higher than the general population is, which is 1 to 2%. So similar to antisocial personality disorder, psychopathy is more commonly diagnosed in men. Now, as far as the thing I want to kind of drive home here is that there is some significant differences, but this is a cluster of personality and thinking and behavioral traits that we should always be on the look for in forensic psychology. Now, there are some genetic factors here that it's important to kind of highlight. When we look at the brain structure and the functional abnormalities, if we look at the amygdala, now the amygdala is part of the brain that helps with giving emotion to memory. So it's about processing emotions such as fear and empathy. And it often shows in research that how the structural and functional abnormalities in individuals with psychopathy. And when you do the research, say looking through fMRIs, they found reduced amygdala volume and activity in psychopaths. Okay, there isn't which basically tells us there's a deficit of emotional processing. Okay, there's the inability to recognize fear or distress in others. And when you combine with that some other things, so there's the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, okay, behind your eyes, and that plays just above your eyes, and that plays some crucial role in decision making and impulse control and moral reasoning. And individuals with both antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy often exhibit abnormalities in this area. And this includes reduced gray matter volume and functional impairments like impulsivity, poor decision making, lack of empathy. Now, there's a thing to kind of keep in mind here. Alcohol does some significant damage to this part of the brain, and so you need to kind of keep that in mind as well. That there are other things that can play into this. There's also the corpus callosum, which connects the two hemispheres, and it's often found to be different in individuals with psychopathy. Some studies suggest that psychopaths have an unusually thick corpus callosum, which may contribute to their ability to process information differently, leading to the emotional detachment and the coldness often seen in these individuals. But there's also the role of genes. There's been research that suggested that genes play a significant role in the development of antisocial personality disorder and developing psychopathic traits. When we look at twin studies, it's estimated that about half of the variance in psychopathic traits can be chalked up to genes. And while genes don't typically, what am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that genes typically, it isn't just a one-to-one thing with genes. Genes interact with each other, and there's a very complex interaction. So there isn't necessarily one single gene that's responsible for psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder. But there are several candidate genes that are associated with these conditions. So, for instance, there's something known as the MAOA gene, sometimes referred to as the warrior gene. We'll talk about that a little bit later in another class. But it is associated with increased aggressiveness, increased impulsivity, and other traits that are common with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. And there are other genetic markers related to serotonin regulation and dopamine regulation that are also implicated. Now, the interesting thing is that this warrior gene, this MAOA gene, is passed through the mother. So the MAOA gene is located on the X chromosome, one of the two sex chromosomes, and women have two chromosomes, double X, while men have one X and one Y. So when a male inherits this warrior gene, it has a much stronger effect because they only have one of them. Whereas when a woman has this warrior gene, it is typically diluted by the second X gene, which typically will not have. Now, when a woman has both, that on both their X genes, and that would certainly be much more significant. But typically, the thing to kind of recognize here is that this is a trait that's passed through the mother. Now, I want to take a little bit more time, and I'm not going to go in too deeply into this because this is a little bit more out there than typically what we would have. And we do want to protect the Hare Psychopathy Checklist integrity. But I do want you to be aware that there are a couple of factors that are of particular importance with the HARE psychopathy checklist. The first one is looking at the interpersonal and affective side. So these are factors related to interpersonal manipulation, affective deficits such as superficial charm, grandiose sense of self, pathological lying, and lack of remorse or guilt. And then factor 2 is lifestyle and antisocial behaviors. So factors focusing on lifestyle instability and antisocial behaviors such as impulsivity, lack of realistic long-term goals, irresponsibility, and juvenile delinquency. So we would look at those, get a score. That would be how it goes. Now, the relationship between psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder and criminal behavior is one of the most critical issues of study within forensic psychology. Both psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder are really strongly associated with criminal conduct, but they influence behavior in very distinct ways. Psychopathy tends to be when someone is a high level psychopathic traits, they're more likely to engage in violent and aggressive behaviors. Psychopaths often commit crimes that are premeditated, cold-blooded, and calculated, and this reflects their lack of empathy and remorse. So they're instrumental versus reactive. They tend to go through the types of violence that is premeditated and goal-oriented, in contrast to reactive violence that is emotional and impulsive. On the other hand, antisocial personality disorder is characterized by this pervasive pattern of behaviors and chronic criminality. So this is going to include things like, lower level crimes as well, not just primarily higher level crimes. So theft, but assault too, and drug trafficking, and typically impulsive and reckless. But unlike psychopaths, individuals with antisocial personality disorder may not always engage in premeditated crimes. They can oftentimes be driven by simple impulsivity and disregard for the consequences, and this leads to this pattern of repeat offenses. So hope you see that there's some significant overlap between these, but they are distinct when we look at them closely. Now, there are some significant costs to society, particularly in terms of the economic burden they impose. Now, individuals with these disorders are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system, which leads to substantial costs associated with policing, legal proceedings, and incarceration. And the repeated offenses, typical of those with antisocial personality disorder as well as psychopathy, result in longer sentences, higher rates of recidivism, and ongoing expenses to the state and federal system. They also have a tendency to have higher health care costs because there are often comorbid conditions along with this, like substance use disorders, which require extensive medical and psychological treatment. And also the injuries inflicted on victims creates higher healthcare costs, including emergency services, higher long-term medical care, higher long-term psychological support for the victims and their families. So the impact on victims of crimes is also a significant part of this. When you're around or being impacted by someone with ASPD or psychopathy, it's not uncommon for you to suffer severe trauma. or post-traumatic stress disorder, or anxiety or depression, because you're being victimized by someone that is manipulative and remorseless. And that just exacerbates the trauma even more, because this person lacks the moral reasoning and the empathy to avoid things like theft and fraud, even to family members and friends. And so it's important, I think, that we all be aware of these individuals, and to also try to figure out ways that we can help them. One of those ways is by specific focused types of cognitive behavioral therapy that focus in on the types of criminal thinking patterns that we talked about earlier on in this course. And when we help people to identify those kinds of thinking patterns and try to avoid them, while they are not going to be able to change the ways that they feel, hopefully they can recognize the thinking patterns and avoid those in order to minimize the harm on others, and ultimately, for their own sake, improve their own lives. Now, the role of psychopathy and antisocial personality in legal proceedings is something we should consider as well, because one of the critical issues in legal proceedings involving individuals with these disorders is the question of criminal responsibility. If someone has a diagnosed disorder, are they fully accountable for their actions? And typically, the legal system does not absolve people of their legal responsibilities because they have these disorders. And it does seem that psychopathy in particular is often associated with harsher sentences due to the perceived risk of recidivism and severity of the crime. But in rare cases, there are some cases where someone will use this as a defense of insanity based upon their inability to feel what other people feel. And there are certainly some ethical questions that need to be asked here by policymakers, by lawmakers, as to what kinds of accommodations should be made for these people. Do we have, for example, in the future, a civil state custody where someone doesn't necessarily have to commit a crime to be put in custody, but not a prison where they're being punished, but maybe a nice community separate from the general population, where they can't cause harm, and in so doing recognizing that they do have a disorder, and so we're not punishing them, but we are also trying to protect the rest of society from them. There are also some challenges with treatment. First off, with antisocial personality disorder, the first thing to kind of recognize here is that personality disorders are long-lasting, rigid, ingrained within the person. It's kind of considered that this has always been there and will always be there. And so there isn't a cure for ASPD or psychopathy. And so it's about managing the symptoms and helping a person to think differently, to reduce the motivation for causing harm to someone else, for helping them to think differently so that perhaps that will change their behavior to some extent. So there are different approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy, some will suggest dialectic behavior therapy, because that is something that was designed for a specific type of personality or disorder known as borderline personality disorder, but it shows some promise with other personality disorders as well. But just to kind of be in mind that that is something that is there. Also, the exploration of pharmacological interventions, while right now it doesn't seem that there is a whole lot that is out there. There are some medications that can help people with things like aggressiveness and impulsivity, and some mood stabilizers, antipsychotics, antidepressants might help with some specific issues, but overall there isn't anything that's a clear treatment for these kinds of disorders. Now, I want to kind of just take a little bit of time and look at some individuals that portray some of these disorders. Case 1, Ted Bundy. And I want you to kind of decide what kind of disorder they have. Now, Ted Bundy is one of the most infamous examples of criminal behavior. Bundy exhibited many traits associated with a certain type of disorder. I'm not going to say which one, but they included things like superficial charm, manipulativeness, and a complete lack of remorse. And its crimes were calculated and brutal, and Bundy confessed to the murder of at least 30 young women across the United States. And his case exemplifies what kind of disorder that's associated with serial predatory violence. And the answer would be psychopathy. Ted Bundy would be considered a psychopath. Then we have case 2, Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer, known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, he was actually diagnosed with this disorder. And his criminal behavior was marked with impulsivity, reckless regard for the safety of others, and extreme acts of violence. Now, while Dahmer also exhibited some of the other traits that we've discussed, he typically was very compulsive and impulsive in his crimes, which did include murder and dismemberment and necrophilia. And so Dahmer we would consider to be someone that has antisocial personality disorder. So you see there's a little bit of a distinction between Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, there are also successful psychopaths. Now, not all psychopaths are involved in overt criminal behavior. So there's this concept that Hare promoted that there are successful psychopaths. And this refers to individuals that exhibit psychopathic traits but channel them into more socially acceptable or even successful careers in business or politics. And these individuals may engage in unethical or manipulative behavior, but they typically are able to avoid the legal consequences because of their charm and their strategic thinking. So the concept of the successful psychopath, typically you think of the high-functioning psychopath, someone who exploits others for their personal gain, but they still have that lack of empathy and that manipulativeness and that grandiose sense of self-worth, that when they use that in particular environments makes them able to manipulate that environment with rewards through being very aggressive and also being very unscrupulous in their behavior. And there are examples of that. Saddam Hussein would have been a great example of that, of a psychopathic leader. Joseph Stalin, Putin would have been an example of that. There are examples of that throughout history. Now, the thing that I have mentioned before is that one needs to be careful about psychopaths. Now, psychopaths can get into power in any nation, But the question is, how strong are the other institutions, and how long does it take for that leader to break down those? And typically it's about 10 years for a psychopathic leader to break down the institutions, to gain hold of power and stay in power. So, like, for example, Putin in Russia, he has changed the constitution, so now he's able to stay in power much longer. And he manipulated the different applications of the constitution for a long time. So he put his buddy in charge for a period of years, and then he came back and became president again. Xi Jinping in China did the same similar kind of thing, where he eventually he manipulated the whole Communist Party and ended up banning term limits. So he's able to be chairman of the CCP for the rest of his life, theoretically. Now, the thing that we've seen in history, though, is that when you have a psychopath that is in power for 10 years, that is when the violence reaches a point where it becomes very dangerous. And we've seen this over and over and over again in history, where that's about the time when the societal safeguards against psychopathy break down and the deaths start to mount, typically through war, sometimes through civil war. And it's pretty consistent that about 10% of the population of the nation that is led by a psychopath, if they're in power for more than 10 years, will die a violent death, which is a little scary. So it's something to kind of keep in mind as we live in our modern world. Now, I want to kind of just close with some key terms. The first term is, what is psychopathy? Psychopathy is a personality construct that's characterized by a constellation of affective, interpersonal, and behavioral traits. And these include things like superficial charm, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and antisocial behavior. Now, although it isn't formally recognized as a distinct disorder, psychopathy is assessed in forensic settings. Then there is antisocial personality disorder, which is a pervasive pattern of behavior starting in childhood or early adolescence and continuing into adulthood that is a disregard for and violation of the rights of others. So it's characterized by chronic antisocial behavior, impulsivity, deceitfulness, irritability, and lack of remorse. And the Hare Psychopathy Checklist is the psychological assessment tool that's used to measure psychopathic traits in individuals, particularly in a forensic setting. So, I'm going to close out with this question. Which of the following traits is most closely associated with psychopathy, but not necessarily with antisocial personality disorder? And if you look through those, the choices are impulsivity, lack of remorse, superficial charm, and aggressiveness. The answer for that would be superficial charm, because superficial charm is a hallmark trait of psychopathy, and it reflects the ability to be engaging and charismatic and persuasive, often for manipulative purposes. Now, while impulsivity, lack of remorse, and aggressiveness can be seen in both antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, superficial charm is more distinctly associated with psychopathy. Hope you enjoyed this lecture. I hope that you found it fascinating, and I hope that you're able to use this in your own life to understand the people around you and hopefully to protect yourself and those that you love in a caring, responsible way. You take care, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.